This is the story of Air India Flight 890. Now, this video is a companion video to my other video on SpiceJet Flight 256. If you have not seen that one, then I'd highly recommend that you watch it. This video will shed some light on how that one happened. On the 5th of January 2014, the skies of Delhi weren't having a particularly good time. It was smoggy and cloudy to the point where planes were having just trouble getting close to the airport. On this day, Air India Flight 890 was making the flight from Delhi to Guwahati and then back again. The flight to Guwahati was fine, while on the ground at Guwahati, the pilots were provided with the weather at Delhi. Like the pilots of Flight 256, these pilots too knew that the weather at Delhi was bad, and they might have to divert to get some bad weather around Delhi. Their alternates for the day, like for SpiceJet 256, was Jaipur and Lucknow, with Lucknow being the primary diversion airport and Jaipur being the secondary diversion airport. On the ground, the pilots were running the numbers to see how much fuel they'd need for the trip. The data told them that they'd need 12.2 tons or 24,000 pounds of fuel for the trip. But since the weather around Delhi was bad, the captain decided to add an extra 500 kilos or about 1,000 pounds of fuel. With that done, the pilots took the A320 into the air. They charted a course for Delhi. ATC took a while, but they eventually cleared Flight 890 up to their cruising altitude. By the time the flight was in contact with Delhi ATC, the visibility on each of Delhi's runways were starting to fall. Some were below minima and some were right at the border of what was viable. Due to the mess that the weather was above Delhi, the plane was put into a holding pattern over Delhi for the next 25 minutes. And even when they did break out of the holding pattern, they would be 12th in line to land. So it's not a stretch to say that these pilots would not be landing anytime soon. At about this point, most pilots would start looking at the weather for their alternates, but these pilots did not. With them starting to creep up on the minimum fuel required to make it to Jaipur, the pilots decided to divert. At the time of the diversion, the weather at Jaipur was favorable, but on their way in, as the plane was closing in on Jaipur, the weather there also started to go bad. The visibility was starting to fall there as well. Like by the time the plane was just 25 DME away from Jaipur, the controller straight up told the pilots that the weather at Jaipur was falling fast. But the pilots of Air India Flight 890 now had to land at Jaipur due to their fuel situation. Much like the crew of SpiceJet Flight 256, these pilots had nowhere else to go. Jaipur was their only option regardless of the weather. They did not have the fuel to go to Ahmedabad, another airport that was close by that other airplanes were choosing to go to. They also couldn't land at Jodhpur, that was an airforce base, and that just left Jaipur as their only true available option for this landing. The weather was so bad that a plane in front of Air India 890 diverted to Ahmedabad. But that wasn't an option for Flight 890 as we talked about before. They absolutely had to land here. With that, the crew of Flight 890 lined up with the runway at Jaipur. They said that they could sort of make out the runway at Jaipur through the fog. Thinking that what they were seeing was the runway, the captain took the plane below the minimum descension altitude, the altitude that you should not go below if you do not see the runway. As the Airbus A320 lost altitude, the captain disengaged the autopilot and took manual control of the plane. He was desperate to put this plane on the ground, but unknown to him, the plane started tracking to the left of the runway. It was no longer lined up with the runway. But in the high stress environment of the cockpit, no one noticed that the plane was deviating to the left of the runway, and so the plane continued to lose altitude, all the way till it touched down on the soft ground next to the runway. At the moment of impact, the crew didn't really know what had happened as the visibility was zero at the time of touchdown, but they were on the ground. As the plane was trying to slow down, the left wing of the A320 sliced through the trees that were inside of the airport. The A320 finally came to a stop near the left hand side of the runway, and the plane was on the ground, and everyone was safe. But this meant that the airport of Jaipur was now out of commission. Other planes in the area would now have to go around and find another place to land. And this put intense pressure on the planes in the area, like SpiceJet Flight 256. So, now we need to know how something like this could happen. How was this crew basically put in a situation where they either had to land their plane in zero visibility or just crash? They were basically hoping that they landed on the runway. The first thing that they found out was that there was no operations center for this flight. The operations center is basically someone who feeds the pilot information throughout the flight that may be important to the pilots, like let's say weather conditions at an alternate airport. Even more concerningly, before they took off from Guwahati, they should have completed what's known as planning minima required for en route slash destination alternate. It's not elegant, but it is what it sounds like. You plan for your weather at your alternates based on the information that you have at the time. Had they done that planning, they would have found out that the weather at Jaipur was not suitable for it to be classified as an alternate airport because the weather at Jaipur was getting worse with time. This combined with the fact that flight dispatch never told the pilots that the weather at Jaipur would be bad meant that the pilots were being sent into a very dangerous situation. Adding on to all of this concern is the fact that the flight dispatchers that they did have were not trained on using the flight planning software that they used at Air India. Flight plans are incredibly important. You basically plan out everything for the flight before you take off. Things like expected fuel burn, expected winds, all that sort of stuff. Flight plans are so personalized to each flight that you can't really copy and paste one flight plan for one flight to another flight, even if both flights are operated by the same route by the same exact type of plane, as there are subtle differences in fuel burn between airplanes, even ones of the same type. It is absolutely insane that Air India basically skipped out on all of this. In addition to all of this, since the plane would be arriving at Delhi at or after sunset, the regulation required one of the pilots to be Cat 3 rated. This is so that the plane can perform a Cat 3 approach if the weather at Delhi is just super, super bad. But Flight 890 had no such pilot. Among all of these reasons for this accident, there's one that stands out. It's a lack of flow of information. The interesting thing is that no one really told the pilots about the deteriorating weather while they were en route. As we talked about before, dispatch really dropped the ball in here. None of the air traffic control units that they passed through really told the pilots about the worsening weather at Delhi. For example, ATC Guwahati, ATC Varanasi could have just been like, hey, just so you're in the know, the weather at Delhi is pretty bad. You might want to start looking at alternates. But the pilots never really asked for that weather at Delhi or their alternates, thus perpetuating the scenario where the pilots did not have a complete picture of what was happening in the skies over India that day. Making matters even worse, the pilot that was in command of Air India Flight 890 was a bit rusty on how to fly Cat 2 or Cat 3 approaches. He had not carried out any Cat 2 or Cat 3 approaches in the last 6 months, and his last simulator check was in 2011. But this still left a few unanswered questions. Why did the crew let themselves be caught in a situation where they basically have no options left? Why did they paint themselves into a corner? They had the opportunity to divert to Lucknow, which had better weather. Why didn't they just do that? Well, as it turned out, the crew wasn't really paying attention to the amount of fuel that they had on board the plane. The crew was supposed to do fuel cross checks every 30 minutes when they were in the air to keep an eye on their fuel state. During post accident interviews, they said that they did do that, but they were unable to provide proof of the same. Let me know in the comments if you think they did that. There are some interesting parallels here between the story of SpiceJet Flight 256 and Air India Flight 890. In the case of SpiceJet Flight 256, we see that the crew diverted to Jaipur instead of Lucknow because of the ease of transportation of both the plane and passengers back to Delhi from Jaipur by road or air. Landing in Lucknow would have made all of that a lot harder for the airlines. The thing is, in this case, there were a ton of chances for the crew to make the right decision. They could have checked the weather. They could have diverted to their primary alternate airport that had better weather. Or they could have just told ATC that they had a fuel emergency. But we still have one last thing to understand here. The Airbus A320 was established on the ILS at Jaipur. How did it end up landing to the left of the runway? Well, looking at the flight data recorder, we see that the autopilot had been disengaged by the captain. He made a few small inputs while landing. The captain commanded a slight left roll, meaning that the plane drifted to the left because of the pilot's actions. This is even more insane when you consider the fact that the captain was landing with basically zero visibility. So many things had to go wrong for this accident to happen, everything from organizational failures to bad supervision to the decisions to the pilots themselves. What's even more interesting is that this accident answers the question of what would have happened to SpiceJet Flight 256 if they had indeed run out of fuel. It is rare that you have two major emergencies in the skies above a region at the exact same time, but that was the case here. We're just glad that this wasn't as bad as it could have been. If you want to watch the other SpiceJet video, then you can find it on your screen right now. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.